The cry was a splinter of glass in the vast, grey silence of the high country. It was thin, ragged, a sound that did not belong amongst the stoic granite and the ancient, sighing pines. It rose and fell with the wind, almost indistinguishable from the whine of air through the rock spires, but it carried a different texture, the unbearable weight of life clinging to its own frayed edge. The woman on the horse, a figure etched against the bruised twilight sky, pulled on the reins. Her horse, a sturdy buckskin that knew the moods of its rider better than the turning of the seasons, stopped without a shudder. The woman's face, a landscape of its own carved by sun and solitude, tilted. Her eyes, the color of a winter lake, scanned the desolate expanse. Every instinct, honed by years of living alone in a land that did not forgive mistakes, told her to ride on. A cry like that was trouble's own herald, a smag in the smooth, lonely rhythm of her existence. But something held her. A ghost of a memory, perhaps, of another small sound lost to a different, colder wind long ago. She nudged the horse forward, not away, but towards the sound, descending into a shallow, rock-strewn basin where the last of the season's snow lay in stubborn, dirty patches. And there he was. A small bundle of red, a color so loud and out of place it felt like a wound in the earth. A boy, no older than 5 or 6, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his dark hair matted to his brow. He was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. He had stopped crying now, his small chest just hitching with the aftershocks of a grief too large for his body. He watched her approach, his eyes wide and dark, holding the resigned terror of a trapped animal. She swung down from the saddle, her movements economical and quiet. She carried no softness in her posture, no easy comfort in her gaze. She was a creature of this hard land, and pity was a currency she did not possess. She stood over him, a tall, gaunt silhouette, and for a long moment, she simply looked. He did not look away. He just watched her, waiting for the end that was supposed to have come already. A tremor ran through his small frame, a quake of cold and fear. The woman grunted, a sound low in her throat, and turning back to her horse, she untied the worn wool cloak from behind her saddle. She did not speak. She simply unfurled it, the scent of wood smoke and horse rising from its folds, and wrapped it around his shivering body. The boy vanished inside its heavy embrace, only the top of his dark head visible. With a motion that was not gentle but was not unkind, she lifted him and set him in the saddle before swinging up behind him. She held him against her, his small, cold body a stark point of contact against her own guarded warmth. She turned the horse, and rode away from the place he was left, the sound of his abandoned cries finally swallowed by the immense, indifferent quiet. Their first days were a ritual of silence, a moving meditation across a landscape that offered no comfort. The woman, he had no name for her, she was simply the warmth at his back, the hand that offered him strips of dried, salted meat, the looming shape that built a fire against the encroaching dark, spoke not a single word. Her language was action, stark and utilitarian. A sharp tug on the cloak meant hold tight, a pointed finger at a distant ridgeline was their compass. A hand held flat, palm down, was a command for absolute stillness. The boy, cocooned in the thick wool and the rhythmic sway of the horse, became a vessel of observation. He learned the cadence of her breath, the subtle shift in her weight that signaled a change in terrain, the way her eyes were never still, constantly sweeping the horizon, reading the secrets of the wind-tossed grass and the flight of a lone hawk. He watched her hands, chapped and scarred, as they expertly stripped bark for tinder, tied a diamond hitch, or cleaned a rabbit with swift, brutal efficiency. He saw the world through her watchfulness, a place of immense scale and minute detail, of profound danger and fleeting beauty. The fear that had been a frozen stone in his chest began to thaw, replaced by a quiet, consuming curiosity. He was no longer just a victim of this world, he was a student of it. The mountains, once a terrifying cage, became a text he was learning to read. The wind, no longer just a lament, carried scents of pine, distant rain, and the promise of snow. He did not know where they were going, or why she had taken him. He only knew the feeling of the horse moving beneath them, the solid presence of her body behind him, and the vast, silent world unfolding before them. Hope was not a word he possessed, but it began to exist in the warmth of the morning sun on his face and the shared heat of the nightly fire, a small, stubborn ember glowing in the deep wilderness of his own silence. He was learning a new way to live, not with words, but with the earth itself, a language of survival taught by a master who communicated only through the quiet poetry of doing. One evening, as a chill that promised the first true frost of autumn bled from the darkening sky, she stopped in a grove of aspens whose leaves trembled like 1,000 gold coins. She slid from the horse and began the familiar ritual of making camp, but this time, as she gathered fallen branches, she paused. She looked at the boy, who watched her from his perch on a fallen log, his small feet not quite touching the ground. She took a dry, brittle branch, broke it cleanly over her knee, and then laid the pieces at her feet. She looked at him again, her gaze direct and unwavering, then turned and walked deeper into the grove. The invitation was unspoken but clear. He slipped from the log, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He mimicked her movements, his small hands struggling to break the dry wood. His fingers were clumsy, the twigs sharp, but he worked with a focused intensity, gathering a small pile of the driest, thinnest branches he could find. When she returned, her arms laden with thicker limbs for the fire, she stopped and looked at the small offering he had gathered. He held his breath. She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of immense weight in their silent world. She knelt, and with her flint and steel, struck a spark into the bundle of tinder he had collected. The spark caught, a tiny orange eye blinking in the gloom, and grew into a fragile flame that licked at the wood. For the first time, he had not just received the gift of fire, he had helped to create it. He sat beside her, closer than usual, and watched the flames dance, their shared creation casting a warm, flickering light on her weathered face. The light softened the hard lines around her mouth and chased the shadows from the hollows of her eyes. In that small circle of warmth, under the shivering gold of the aspens, something shifted. A bond, forged not in words but in shared hardship and the simple, profound act of making a fire together, had taken root. He was no longer just cargo she carried, but a partner in the elemental struggle for life. And in the quiet acknowledgement of his contribution, he felt a flicker of something he had long forgotten, a sense of his own worth. The world vanished in a fury of white. The blizzard descended without warning, a roaring beast of wind and snow that erased the sky, the mountains, the very ground beneath their feet. It was a physical assault, the wind tearing at them with icy claws, the snow blinding them, stinging their exposed skin. The woman reacted with instinct born of long, harsh winters. She urged the horse into the meager shelter of a rock outcropping, its granite face already plastered with a growing wall of white. But it wasn't enough. The wind howled around the edges, a hungry predator. She slid from the saddle, pulling the boy with her, and scrambled towards the base of a colossal, ancient fir tree whose roots clawed at the frozen earth like the talons of a great bird. There, in a hollow scraped out by wind and time, she pushed him deep into the recess. Using her knife, she began hacking at the lower boughs of the fir, the evergreen sent sharp and clean in the frozen air. She packed the boughs around them, creating a makeshift den, a fragile fortress against the storm's siege. Inside, the roar of the wind muted to a deep, vibrating moan. They huddled together in the green-scented darkness, the horse a silent, snow-caked statue just outside. Cold, a living thing, seeped in through the cracks. The woman pulled the boy tight against her, wrapping the cloak around them both, a desperate act of shared warmth. In the suffocating dark, with the storm raging, her own ghosts came for her. A memory surfaced, sharp and cruel as a shard of ice, a different storm, a different child. A small, mittened hand, warm and trusting in hers, and then the sudden, sickening emptiness as it was ripped away by a whiteoat on a high pass. A loss that had hollowed her out, leaving behind this stoic, silent shell. A tremor went through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The boy, pressed against her side, felt it. He did not know the source of her pain, but he recognized its shape. He shifted, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and pressed his cheek against her arm. It was not a gesture of a child seeking comfort, but of one offering it. In the heart of the blizzard, in their tiny, fragile cave, the roles of protector and protected blurred, and for a fleeting moment, his silent presence was a balm for a wound she thought could never be touched. Days later, gaunt and weary from the storm's aftermath, they saw it. A thin, grey plume of smoke rising against a backdrop of deep green pine, a fragile tether connecting the earth to the sky. It was a sign of life, a thing so rare in their journey it felt like a mirage. The woman steered the horse towards it, her movement slow and deliberate. Caution was a religion in this land. The smoke led them to a cabin, hunkered down in a small clearing as if it had grown from the ground itself. It was a brutish, solid-looking structure of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney and small, suspicious windows like squinting eyes. As they approached, the heavy plank door creaked open. A man emerged, holding a long rifle not with aggression, but with the casual familiarity of a man for whom it was a third hand. He was old, his face a gnarled road map of hard years, his beard a tangle of grey and white. He watched them come, his eyes narrowed, missing nothing, the exhaustion of the horse, the woman's gaunt frame, and the small, dark-haired boy peering out from behind her leg. "Keep going," he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping on rock. "Got no room for strays," the woman said nothing. She simply slid off the horse, her body stiff with cold and fatigue, and stood her ground. She didn't plead or explain. She just waited. The old man's gaze fell on the boy. He saw the thinness of his face, the oversized cloak that swallowed him, the way he clung to the woman's leg not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet loyalty. The man's hostile expression faltered, a brief crack in the hardened facade. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Trouble always finds the damned," he muttered, more to himself than to them. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and lowered the rifle. With a jerk of his head, he indicated the open doorway. "Fire's hot. Stew's on. Don't be tracking the whole damn winter in with you." The invitation was as gruff as the rejection had been, but it was an opening. It was the promise of 4 walls, a solid roof, and a respite from the relentless, biting wind. It was sanctuary. The inside of the cabin was a single room, dense with the smells of wood smoke, simmering meat, and drying herbs. It was cluttered but orderly, a testament to a long, solitary life. Without another word, the old man, who they would come to know only as Silas, ladled a thick, savory stew into 2 wooden bowls and set them on a rough-hewn table. They ate in a shared, hungry silence, the warmth of the food spreading through their chilled bodies like a slow-dawning sun. Silas sat across from them, cleaning his rifle, his eyes occasionally flicking up to study his guests. He watched the boy, who ate with a quiet, desperate focus, his small hands wrapped tightly around the warm bowl. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice still a low rasp. "A stray finds you," he said, looking directly at the woman, "it's 'cause you got a space it can fill. Nature don't like a vacuum." His gaze was sharp, perceptive, seeing past the grime and exhaustion to the hollowed-out places within her. The woman met his eyes but offered no reply. Her silence was its own story, one he seemed to understand. Later, as they prepared to rest on a pallet of furs he had laid out near the hearth, Silas approached the boy. He knelt down, his old joints cracking in protest. From a pocket in his worn vest, he produced a small object. It was a bird, a raven, carved from a piece of dark, polished wood, its form simple but perfect. He pressed it into the boy's small hand. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch. The boy looked from the carving to the old man's face. Silas's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something ancient and knowing. "Everything finds its flock," he said, his voice softer now. "Even the ones that fly alone." For a while he gave the woman a pouch of salt and a new whetstone for her knife. His charity was practical, unsentimental, but profound. It was the gift of tools, of sustenance, of a small, solid piece of hope to carry back out into the wild. They left the sanctuary 2 days later, their bodies rested, their supplies replenished. A fragile, unspoken gratitude hung in the air as Silas watched them go, standing in his doorway until they were just small shapes swallowed by the immense forest. They traveled south, guided by the woman's unerring sense of direction and a promise of a lower, warmer valley she seemed to hold in her mind's eye. The landscape began to change. The granite peaks softened into rolling, timbered hills, and the air lost some of its biting edge. A sense of cautious optimism began to settle over their silent journey. Then she saw the tracks. She reined in the horse so sharply the boy bumped against her back. She dismounted, her body coiled with a sudden, tense alertness. In the soft earth beside a creek were hoof prints. But these were not the splayed, wild tracks of deer or elk. They were the clean, sharp crescents of shod horses, 3 of them, moving with a disciplined purpose that spoke of riders, not animals. And alongside them, another set of prints, smaller, almost lost in the confusion. The boy slid down from the horse before she could stop him. He stared at the tracks, and a stillness came over him, a terrifying quiet that was different from his usual silence. It was the stillness of a hunted thing that hears the baying of the hounds. His past, which had been a formless, abstract shadow, had just taken on the solid, undeniable shape of a footprint in the mud. The woman watched his reaction, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife on her belt. The sanctuary with Silas had been a pause, a breath. But the world was still out there. The quiet valley she sought was not just a destination, it was now an escape. The past was not a ghost to be outrun. It was a hunter, and it was closing in. She scanned the ridgeline, her eyes narrowed, her jaw set. The brief peace was over. The journey had become a flight. They were cornered 2 days later. The rolling hills flattened into a wide, stony canyon, a natural trap with high, unscalable walls. As they rounded a bend, the 3 riders were there, blocking the path. They sat on their dark, powerful horses, motionless, like statues carved from the same rock as the canyon walls. They were not men of this country. They wore heavy, dark coats that were too fine for the wilderness, and their faces were impassive, closed. They carried no visible rifles, but their presence was an absolute, suffocating threat. One man, clearly the leader, urged his horse forward a few paces. He looked past the woman, his eyes fixed solely on the boy. He spoke, and the sound of his voice, a melodic and precise torrent of words in a language the woman did not know, filled the canyon. The boy flinched as if he'd been struck. The man spoke a name, sharp and commanding. It was a key turning in a lock that had long been rusted shut. He beckoned with his hand, a gesture that was not an invitation but an order. The woman slowly, deliberately dismounted. She did not draw her knife, but she placed herself squarely between the boy and the men, a silent, unyielding barrier. Her mind, a whirlwind of tactical calculations, the distance, the terrain, the impossible odds, fell silent. All that remained was a single, primal instinct: protect. She would not win a fight against 3 men. She knew that. But she would be a wall of fire and steel they would have to burn through to get to him. She did not look at the boy. She did not tell him what to do. The choice had to be his. The men had come for him, and the life they offered was his to reclaim or reject. The canyon held its breath, the silence stretching taut, ready to snap. The world had shrunk to the space between 2 lives. Behind him stood the men, emissaries of a past he could barely remember but could feel in his bones, a life of cold stone courtyards, whispered instructions, and a crushing weight of expectation. Before him stood the woman, a creature of wind and rock, her face a testament to hardship, but her eyes a promise of fierce protection. She was the smell of wood smoke, the warmth of a shared cloak, the solid, unshakable certainty of a hand that knew how to build a fire in a blizzard. He looked from the hard, impassive faces of the riders to the weathered, cracked canvas of her face. He saw the past, a closed door. He saw a future, a vast, open wilderness. He took one, small, shuddering breath. Then, with a resolve that seemed to come from the very core of the earth beneath his feet, he turned his back on the men. He took a single, deliberate step forward, moving from the shadow of his past and into the space she had carved out for him. He reached up and put his small, dirt-stained hand into her larger, scarred one. Her fingers closed around his instantly. He looked up at her, his dark eyes clear and steady. And then he spoke. His voice, fragile from disuse, thin as a bird's egg, cracked the profound silence of the canyon. "Gio," he said. The word was quiet, almost carried away by the wind, but it landed with the force of a landslide. Home. It was not a question or a plea. It was a declaration. It was the planting of a flag in new, hard-won soil. He had made his choice. The leader of the men watched this silent, powerful exchange. His impassive face registered a flicker of something, resignation, perhaps, or even a sliver of understanding. He held the woman's gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He wheeled his horse around, and without a backward glance, he and the other men rode away, their purpose dissolved, their power broken by a single word from a child who had chosen his own name for home. They found their valley a week later, a place so perfectly secluded it felt as if the land had been keeping it safe just for them. It was cupped in the palm of green-mantled mountains, bisected by a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth, grey stones. The air was warmer here, scented with rich soil and wild mint. This was not a place to pass through, this was a place to stay. And so they began to build. The work became their new language, more eloquent than any spoken tongue. The rhythmic thud of the woman's axe against pine was a heartbeat. The rasp of the saw blade was a steady breath. She showed him, with patient hands, how to notch logs so they fit together as if they had grown that way. He learned the satisfying heft of a hammer, the sharp, clean smell of freshly split cedar, the sticky resilience of pine pitch. He was small, but his purpose gave him strength. He carried tools, gathered moss to chink the walls against the wind, and used a drawknife to peel long, fragrant ribbons of bark from the logs, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were not merely constructing a shelter from the elements, they were forging a future, log by log. They were building a world with their own four hands. One evening, as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky, they sat on the raised floor of their half-finished cabin. The wall stood 2 logs high, a skeleton of a home, open to the heavens. The woman pointed to a bright cluster of stars low on the horizon. "The sisters," she said, her voice quiet in the vastness. The boy looked where she pointed, his eyes wide with wonder. "Sisters," he repeated, his voice gaining strength and confidence with each new word he learned. She handed him a piece of bread, and he took it, their hands brushing in the cool air. The silence that fell between them now was no longer one of loneliness or uncertainty. It was a silence that was full of shared effort, of quiet understanding, and of a profound, unshakable sense of peace. Here, in this valley, under the watchful eyes of the mountains and the silent company of the stars, they had found their flock. They had built their home. They had arrived.